He goes to daycare.
Good morning. Glad you're here this morning. This is another one of those classes. It's a little bit different. We're going to be talking about modern mindset. This topic, this idea has been brought up a couple of times. I guess primarily by Warren, talking about a lot of things about the modern mindset. And I want to just take this class just to kind of look at and emphasize why we think the way we do today. And I'll wait till later on in class to bring that out. But that's the reason for this class. And this kind of fits into the big topic of how we got the Bible. I will say I have 2 more lessons left. That's this one and one more. This one may take 2 classes, and the next one I'm sure will take 2 classes. So we have 3 or 4 more classes in this.
I would argue that the modern mindset affects mostly the way we interpret the Bible.
And that's very true.
And that's what we will take on after this.
And so Dr. McClure says the next series of classes are going to bounce off of this on how we interpret the Bible, which is directly influenced by the way we think, which is modernity, which is the modern mindset, which is where we are today. And that's what.
But it'll be a little bit more broad ranging than that. We'll start out with written language, speech, which leads to being able to have things like the Bible, and then we will kind of get into, well, you've got it, what do you do with it? What have people before us done with it? What does a modern mindset do to it? Of Christ's Stone Campbell restoration movement, what did it do with it different than other people?
Okay. So when we talk about context, what does that mean to you, context? Is it important?
Yes.
What?
It gives you more of the definition of the word or how
Okay.
the word is used.
All right.
It's
Very
the
good.
words around the word.
Yeah, exactly. So we've often understood context as what were the people like, what did they believe back then, who wrote it, to whom was it written, how does it fit with other scripture, and really do not proof text. And that's kind of, when we talk about looking at context, we don't want to proof text, but we want to take the whole paragraph, or probably the whole chapter, or maybe even the whole book to kind of understand what's going on. And then the specific phrase that we're talking about, how does it go into that full picture of what's going on? And all this is very true. So, it's just, this is going to be a class that you may not particularly like, because there's going to be a lot of facts today. A lot of facts. But I want to ask, how does it fit into my context, our own context, the world that we live in context? How does it fit with us today? What I want to do then is say, what does it mean? 21st century. If it's written for a people or a culture centuries ago, what does it mean to me today? When we talk about modernity, what does that mean to me? Why is it that we concentrate on logical thinking, reasoning thinking, solving problems, even when we address the Bible? It hasn't always been that way. It really hasn't. When did it start? Just for example, we're going to go to that, but for example, before the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, what was the mindset? People up here tell the people down here what the Bible is about. You'll listen to it and you'll obey it. Period. That's what it was about. It changed with the modern mindset. So at least twice in this series, we have said, trust in God rather than needing to be certain. I serve a loving God. We should strive to be certain, but we should refrain from a preoccupation of correct thinking. It leads one to arrogance and hatred to those who think differently. So where did this preoccupation of correct thinking originate? And I think it is in the modern mindset. And so,
Renaissance.
in the Renaissance, which
The marker at the end of the Middle Ages.
right. So, which is what this lesson is all about. So, as we look at this context, how it fits our context, I want to look at 3 ways. Well, number one, that we're not the center of the universe. We'll dive into that a little bit. We need to be aware of our influences in the world, and helps us reimagine the Bible in our own lives. And I'm not saying change it, but In other words, how does it fit me? How does it fit my life? How does it directly fit my life in what we're doing? So it helps us to understand that we're not the center of the universe. So this is really an important and difficult concept to grasp, that we're not the center of the universe. I mean, just my life is who I am. That's all I know is where I am. I'm the center of the universe. Well, that's not true. We've been taught that knowledge was static. There's only one right way to view the world. Christianity it gave us that way, and it's pretty much how we've always thought about it since, really, the world began, since creation. Our views of God and our views of the world are not universal. They're not absolute. When I say of the world and of religion, so I'm going to give you an example of the world, and I'm going to give you an example of religion, and religion in at least a broad term. So in 1991, I went to Brazil, and I was with this company, and I go in that morning and says, would you like some coffee? I said, yes, I would. You know what I got? A little cup about that big. And it was stiff. I go, man, that's my first introduction to an espresso. So everybody doesn't think like we do. Okay, so espresso is more common today than it was. But in 1991, it wasn't common. I had no idea what this was. And I smiled and drank it and thought it was the worst thing I ever drank. Okay? So then in the late 1990s, we went to Panama on mission trips, and there was a VBS there regularly every year. And in the late 1990s, as we would go to that VBS, this was for children, and women were conducting the VBS. Women were in charge of VBS. And so that is a different mindset. That is a different culture. So another thing is it helps us be aware of the influences in our world. If we do not admit, if we do not admit that we have a historically situated context, if we somehow think that our beliefs about the world are universal, we are blindly accepting those influences. 2 weeks ago, we call that what? Bias. So we are biased. If we just, we're biased because that's where our mindset is, that's where our lens focus is. And that's really not good. I mentioned this earlier, and I want to mention it again today because it really fits where we are. There's a story about two fish swimming along, and an older fish meets them, and he nods to them, and he says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swam for a bit, and then one looks at the other and said, "What in the world is water?" You see, we often have trouble seeing things because we're so accustomed to our surroundings, what is around us, and that's really all we think about while we're focused on. And we need to understand there is another world out there. So I think that really fits on what we're talking about today. A lot of those influencers are healthy, helping us head in the right direction. We need to be influenced by our context, like we have any other choice. But sometimes those influences might not be so healthy. For example, and there are many examples, I'm going to give you a less controversial one, but there are controversial ones as well. But the King James Version is the only Bible, and we should use that. Well, that's not really good thinking. Have we forgotten how to be critical thinkers? Have we forgotten about biases that are in our life? So, yes.
Yeah, kind of going along with that in modernism, we in the West, and it goes all the way back to Plato, but especially after the Renaissance, we tend to forget what is the nature of language, and there's a lot of emphasis on the nature of language, and what studying the etymology of words and studying original languages, because we think we can come to know the truth, but we make a very fundamental mistake in doing that, because this is going to sound controversial at first, but the Word of God is not truth. The Word of God is true because it points to the truth, and the truth is the Logos made flesh, in other words, a relationship with Him. Now, some people believe, some theologians believe that prior to the Tower of Babel, before language was confused, that there was a kind of meta language, that language had no arbitrariness into it. It was intricately and truly tied to reality. So, and after Babel, that was disconnected. And we see this when you study language, that there is this arbitrariness to it. So we mistake you could really think about language more in terms of a map. But we think of, sometimes, we mistake the map for the terrain. And when you start thinking about it that way, language ironically becomes more useful because it's better suited for that mindset as opposed to, and it's especially true given what the gospel, the good news of the gospel is, that it's not this objective external thing. It is a relational thing with Christ.
And that's where I'm going to go. And as we get near the end, I'll be talking about objectivity and subjectivity and objectivity. We don't want to be totally objective. We don't want to be totally subjective either. And that's kind of where I'm going to go as we continue. So number 3 helps us reimagine the Bible in our own lives. So when we understand where we've come from and where we are, we can approach the Bible in a healthier way. When we admit the gap between the world of the Bible and the world we live in, think of all the years between then and now. When we are cognitive of that gap, we can better respect the Bible for what it is, instead of constantly trying to make it fit into a world where it does not fit in. And the slide I keep showing you to demonstrate that is what? I don't have it today. So it's not a rule book, but it's a book of wisdom. So it's kind of like trying to shove a square peg into a round hole. And one thing I want to say, and we kind of already alluded to that, the Bible and God are not synonymous terms. So, Dark Ages. The dawning of the Dark Age started around 325 in the Common Era. There was Nicaea, and there we see organization, formality, nominalism, and materialism.
About the Dark Age of the church, or most people date the Dark Age to the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, which is in the 450s.
This is the dawning of the Dark Age. So this is as the Dark Age approaches, right? So you're right. The Dark Age was before that, but the Dark Age is somewhat after this. So this is the dawning of it, all right? So when did persecution stop? Were people in the church persecuted?
Yes.
Severely?
Yes.
When did it stop? Well, it didn't. It really did.
When Christianity became the religion of the state.
That's right. That's right.
Starting with Constantine and continuing for another 100 years after that.
Constantine the emperor met with all the bishops. I mean, wow. He met with all the bishops and let's get together and decide. So, I mean, he was the leader. And let's say he called a conference of all the elders of the group. So, but in the result of this, Christianity picked up a lot of bad Roman practices resulting from this. And it's still with us today. For example, organization. It became more formal, more Roman worship. There was no longer a loose confederation of people, but let's get organized with a creed. Sign it, else we're going to be excommunicated and or exiled. And it's, by the way, it's not just a written creed, just a general creed that this is what we believe, and of course you don't sign those, but
Well, and I think this is I wish more people would study some of this stuff, because this goes back to your fish in a water analogy. It's something we've always done and known and thought. We kind of think of it as just a given. It's almost like a blind spot, and so like you can take a lot of examples, but if like one example is if we know a lot more about like the first few centuries in terms of how they did the Lord's Supper, and a lot of early Christian theologians they go a second century Christian would not understand the way we do the Lord's
Yep.
Supper. They would say, oh, your fellowship meal must be
Right.
because that was what it was closer
Yeah,
to, like,
so we're coming to that. We're gonna get to that, right? So they had the backing of the government even to accomplish what they were trying to do. And so later on, a bishop would take control. Well, which bishop would take control? The bishop of the most important city of the time, right? And that would be Jerusalem. Not really, not really. What's happened to Jerusalem? It burned, the temple, so who is the most prominent city of that day?
Rome.
Rome. So it was the Bishop of Rome. And you know what? I'm told that today the Pope is still called the Bishop of Rome. So the bishops could decide who received grace or not, who was baptized or not, who received communion or not. Furthermore, communion was illegal at home after AD 70 because a bishop had to administer that communion. Well, who administers and or distributes the Lord's Supper? It doesn't make a difference. It's not scriptural. And so this Lord's Supper is really different today than it was then, much, much different. So leadership today needs to counter this dogma and ensure an upside down approach. Where do we get this example of an upside down approach? What chapter in the Bible? Okay, what's the event that Jesus did to be the
He
servant?
washed the feet.
Okay, when he washed the feet, that's John 13. That's the upside down approach. And reversing this idea of the Roman organization of one leader, or even say a group of leaders, let's say the elders are the top, giving instructions down, turn that upside down and be serving and let the people be the part of the church and have their voices known and understood. So we also have formality. So you have organization and now formality. In bigger cities, there were bigger buildings, and that's where court was held, important things, and there were big, elaborate buildings, and that's where the church met. Pomp and circumstance, vestments and robes and incense, and a grand procession, bishop entering, pomp and circumstance, choir singing, and the Lord's Supper was changed from a meal to like it is that we do today. That's not in Scripture. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with the way we do it today. But let's not claim that's the way it was back then. They had a meal, and as part of that meal, they remembered Christ's death and his resurrection and the body and the bread that they drank and the wine that they drank. And they remembered during that meal. So, but it's not in Scripture that we changed it like we did today. Again, I'm not saying we're wrong in the way we do it today, but let's not claim that it's like it was then. So there was organization, formality, and also nominalization. Nominalism, really. Are you a Christian? Yeah, sure. There's no ill effects now to being a Christian because the Christians and the government are hand in hand. You didn't have to worry about it. At that time, there was no more persecution, or very little persecution at that time because everybody was a Christian. Sure, I'm a Christian. Before this, if you ask if you're a Christian and you say, yeah, you risk being killed or hurt or whatever. But now it's not hard so much to say. Because when this emperor came and set up and made the church and the state like one, then it caused major problems. And then the fourth one was materialism. The wealthy too came to church, and that's good, unless you shove the poor to the margins. If coziness exists between church and state, which is what was happening then, who's it good for? The state. Who's it bad for? The church. Why? Because of the compromise that was being seen. That's not.
You were talking about the Lord's Supper and the differences. When I was growing up, and probably you and probably some more in here, if you had erred, I mean, you weren't supposed to take the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
It
was a
because
closed communion.
Yeah. If you missed services or you went and got drunk or something, anyway, you erred. You
You
didn't
shouldn't be
take,
doing it.
no, you didn't take communion.
The Presbyterians during Thomas Alexander Campbell's day, to be able to have communion, you had to have the Inquisition before. You had to get your communion token. So you had to come before a board.
Wow.
And you had to get a token.
Yeah.
And then when they had the communion service, you brought your token, and then you would be given communion because you had to be determined to be worthy to take communion.
Some theologians argue that the reason why men serve communion today, when we used to do that, it was because it goes back to early Catholicism, because the priest was the only
That's what
one
I'm
that
pointing out. That's what I pointed out in a few slides ago.
could
I didn't say it all out loud, but yeah, that's what I was pointing out.
But they thought of it as only a priest, and now a male can mediate.
A leader, it's a leading position.
And I'm
Not a
not
leading
suggesting-
position, it's a serving position.
And so the first 3 centuries, women served communion because it was considered
A servant.
a meal, a service,
Yeah.
a servant
Yeah.
role. It was not a leadership role.
So this modern mindset, where did it all come from? Christendom had 2 parts. You had the ecclesiastical structure, the church, which is the spiritual side, and then you had the political or the practical side of things. So the Pope would lead the spiritual needs, and he had a hierarchy of people. He had bishops and archbishops and priests and so forth. And then you had the emperor, who would tend to lead the political or practical needs of the people. And so they were side by side. So, starting about 410 AD, the Alarics Goth sacked Rome, and that's the beginning of this move. A new structure had been brewing, had been building over the last several centuries before 410. And with so many factions over such a large geographical area, the Roman Empire had consolidated all people groups. And so this religious structure, or this new structure that had started forming was what? Religious structure with what? Roman Catholic Church. And so that's the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church and the structure that it had begun to build. But you know what? The only social glue at this time that had a chance of holding things together was the church. Now, this wasn't the churches of Jesus' day or even your ancestral church or your traditional church. This was a powerhouse organization structure that formed the basis of the new society, which historians will later call Christendom, the Roman Catholic Church. But of course, they didn't always agree on everything about jurisdictions, authority, and so forth. And so there was an uneasy alliance to form this structure of society and culture. So for about 1,000 years, from about 500 AD to about 1500 AD, the Roman Catholic Church had significant influences on all areas of ethics and knowledge and authority and identity. And this came mediated to us through the church and the state, 2 bureaucratic systems. They were divinely ordained, had authority of the known world. So with this authority, and so this divinely ordained authority, they had the authority to translate God's will to the people. And this led us all the way to the Middle Ages. So all through this Dark Ages, this about 500 to 1500, or some may say 400 to as early as 1250. Because about 1250 to 1500, it was like a pre-modern time. So these numbers are not set. But so the church was important. They could tell people, this is what the word. People were illiterate at that time, so they could tell people, this is, I'm telling you, now you go do it. And the people had no other choice. Thought they had no other choice, but they did it. This is all leading to where we're going. So the Roman Empire, as a unifying force, broke down in the 5th century and was replaced by Christendom. And as I said, it was an uneasy alliance between the God-ordained state and the religious power of the day, which was the Roman Catholic Church. It still was very hierarchical in form, and it reigned as a unified political force from about 400 to 1300. However, in about 1250, scholars say 1250 to 1500, the late Middle Ages or the early modern ages, and that time was coming. This version of Christendom would begin to be replaced by what is called modernity, or the modern mindset. So, transition from Dark Ages to modernity. So,
It's also at this period of time you start getting the rise of scholasticism, and you start seeing another group come onto the scene, and that becomes intellectual. You start
Right.
seeing the formation and the development of universities. And so now then we have three power groups, different powers, but we have the political powers, we have the religious powers, and then we have this intellectual power that's starting to rise at the level of universities and stuff. And that becomes quite important when we move to the Renaissance and humanism and the ability of man to reason and make decisions and figure things out and to find the absolute truth, which is one of our failings of modernity is this concept
we're into that.
you can find the
Yeah,
absolute.
exactly. So what happened in the 13 to 1400s? This monumental shift toward the modern mindset, this transition time. Well, there were three important events or shifts, and when we talk about Florence, the area of Florence, Petrarch and Erasmus, and they just symbolized these changes. I mean, they weren't necessarily the change, but they were one of the people in this time frame that led to this change. Florence was the rise of the Republic, and thus the rise of the middle class. What's the definition of republic? Definition of republic. We live in a republic society.
Well, it's not,
We're not Democrats or Republicans. No, it's not it.
I was just saying, it's obviously not democracy. We live not in a democracy, but a republic.
A republic.
A representative republic.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Go ahead and say it.
That we live in a representative republic.
It's a representative. It's a people governing by representative. That's what a republic is. So Florence led to the rise of this and the rise of the middle class. Petrarch and the resurgence of classical literature, and Erasmus were the rumblings of religious reform. So Florence, the rise of the republic, and so the rise of the middle class. So Florence was a region in Italy, and it represented the rise to the republic. So for about 200-300 years before this modern shift, Florence had already begun planting seeds for the operating outside the political bounds of the way that Christendom worked. So when things change, you don't just turn a light switch on and change. It just starts gradually changing. So from about 1250 to about 1500, things started to change. Florence was, so it was less hierarchical, and therefore a lot of financial things were flourishing. It was giving lots of money to arts and literature, and so culture started to flourish as well. So by the time we get to the heart of the Renaissance, there are more republics cropping, and of course political things that led to two monumental revolutions: the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution 1789, solidified the modern era of government. It was the dissolving of the church and state way of thinking, which had been in place for centuries, which is the divine rule of individuals from the upper echelon of the church. So with the rise of the Republic and the middle class, represented by Florence, this really is the foundation of modernity. So then we go to Petrarch. Petrarch lived in 1300s and is often credited for being the spark of the Renaissance. We talk about Renaissance, so Petrarch is often the spark of that. He's called the father of humanism. He was a traveler, collector, and as he went around looking for things, he found Greek and Roman and Latin manuscripts and of often forgotten writers and various writers. And so he got acquainted with these, and he began to believe that the world he lived in was ignorant. What does ignorant mean? Lack of knowledge. So it wasn't sometimes, but it was just lack of knowledge. So he began to say, hey, these people don't know what's going on. They lack knowledge. And so he is the one that is credited for calling that age before that the Dark Ages, those ignorant fools in the past. So with his help, there was an explosion of interest and accessibility of what we think today as the foundation of the modern world of thinking. These writers began to see this foundation of Western thought were only accessible because of people like Petrarch, who began to find these manuscripts and really be interested in them. So these famous intellectuals of the Middle Age could not actually go back to the original sources. And so there was a common cry over centuries, 100 years, was ad fontes. which is back to the sources. Let's get back to the sources of our thinking. Petrarch was a leader in this resurgence of classical literature. So if we say back to the sources from how we got the Bible point of view, what are we talking about? Back to the
Original writers.
original writers in the original languages. So Greek and Hebrew, original writers. And so we can't get back to the original writers, and so we get back to as far as we can. So, as Petrarch led people to think outside the box on things like identity, ethics, knowledge, authority. Remember, those are the ones that the Roman Catholicism and the church had been, that was about, everything about all these things was centered around the Roman Catholic Church. And so they began to think outside the box on this. It started to allow people to think outside the bounds of Christendom. And while Petrarch brought classics back into discussion, Erasmus began to see the implications for church doctrine and tradition, returning to the original documents like Greek and Hebrew manuscripts so they could revise Bible translations, doctrines, and church practices. So just like Luther, less than a generation earlier, he was hoping for a reform of the Catholic Church. It wasn't his intent to start anything new, just reform it. He was asking that the church authority recognize the literature, scholarly practices that began to proliferate during his lifetime. And his writings were incredibly influential during this time. So, two of the most influential books of that day was from Erasmus. He argues against the empty formalism of church tradition. You know, formalism in church tradition, we talked about that way back in Constantine, back in 325, formalism. So we picked up that practice of formalism. Erasmus wanted to argue against that type of formalism and church tradition. Is it gone? No, it's still not gone. We still have a ways to go. And he had a book which argued against that, and he had another book which was really a satire, which attacked the abuses and superstitions of the Catholic Church of that day. So, of course, less than a decade later, Martin Luther is going to post his 95 Theses in 1517, which sparked the Protestant Reformation and the splintering of the Western religious identity and one of the universal Catholic Church into Lutheranism, Calvinism, and all the isms that we have today in the church. So, the history of the modern mindset. We had Florence, which was the rise of the Republic, the middle class, Petrarch, which was a resurgence of classical literature, and Erasmus, the rumblings of religious reform. It's important to say then that these three are representative of what's going on. There are many others, but they are representative of that. And it's not that they were out on an island. It's not like we turned a light switch on and it happened. This was over time. Culture shifts occur over time. It's the interplay of thinking of these people. So the result of this was the modern mindset. And it extends from about 1500 to somewhere on the order of the 20th century. Yes, Donnie?
I have always thought it strange, I guess. There are things that we, and I'm not just saying Graymere, Christians, Church of Christ, will say no to, because it's not there. And then there's things that they say yes, and it's really not there. In other words, you know, when Lydia met with the Christians on the water bank, you know, you would think that if Lydia wasn't kind of in charge, and I'm not talking about an elder or a deacon, but kind of in charge, it would have said the man's name. You know, so, you know, women don't do anything. But yet we can say, well, they met on the side of the bank, but today we meet in church buildings. In other words, we got things that we say, you know, this is okay, but still, this is not okay. And You know,
Again, once again, formalism.
But most of it has come down because of our tradition.
That's
It's
right.
handed down. You are influenced by people that are influenced by people that are influenced, and you don't realize it, but you are. And you take those things that you have been told, and if you are a strong supporter, you bring that back into the biblical text that you look for as your source of authority, and you confirm those beliefs by picking out the things that go along with them in a proof text manner and ignoring all the other stuff. Now, if you are a radical skeptic, I get accused of that sometimes, you go back and you look and you say, that's not right, okay? And when things drift so far apart, you do have these Reformation, restoration type movements, and even Erasmus goes on to lead a significant restoration of a type within the Catholic Church that ends in the Council of Trent and reforms a lot of these practices that Luther outlined.
As did Luther,
in his
yeah, as did
95
Luther,
Theses.
right. Yeah.
You know, it's definitely there that men are to serve as elders and deacons, and the elders have authority over everybody. But what does that mean?
Well, you also have to realize that all these texts are written within a common shared collective understanding. The common shared collective understanding at the time of these writings is that women's roles are not what we have now allowed women's roles to.
There's a lot of culture, a lot of culture.
So, so things that, just because you see practices that are enshrined in the text, they're enshrined in the text because that's the practices that existed at the time. And there were no really other alternatives. Now, you can read between the lines, and you can see that probably Jesus surrounded himself with far more women than other people. Paul gives women a far greater role in a lot of things than what was typical. But it's only in the modern era, modernism, that women become anywhere close to being equal with men.
Right.
Okay?
So I anticipated this would be a two-class session, and it will be, so we're about halfway through. So just so you know, modernity started about the 1500s or so, and went to really, I mean, if we wanted to set a time, maybe Second World War or something like that, and so that's kind of near where we are. So we're in a transition time now between modernity and
But we're
post.
still strongly influenced.
But we're
by
still
modernity
strongly
in
influenced.
multiple areas.
In multiple areas. We're going to talk about that a lot.
Just a
Yes,
quick question. A lot of this is based in Europe. Is there any evidence of Christianity in the Far East, like China and India? During,
No,
we know much
had
about.
not spread there.
Okay.
I mean, you've got the same type of movement religiously that's starting in the United States with the First Great Awakening, which is in the 1700s, which leads to the Second Great Awakening, which is at the very end of the 1700s, early 1800s, which is when the Stone Campbell movement and the American Restoration movement begins. We're now getting a couple hundred years after this. But so we get this, Protestantism arises with Luther's, Zwingli, Calvin. There's kind of this split between the Catholic Church and Protestants. And then Protestantism goes in hundreds of different directions. I mean, literally speaking. And there's a whole very complicated history of all that.
Okay, so we'll talk about this more next week. We'll continue on this, and then we'll have one more final lesson, which will take 2 weeks. Thank you.